Welcome, everyone, to a brand new deep dive. We're just so incredibly thrilled to have you joining us today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and before we really get started, make sure you like and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these extensive, long-form deep dives.
I definitely don't want to miss this one.
Right. Because we have a truly monumental task ahead of us today, and you are going to want to be here for every single minute of it. Today, we are undertaking an ultra-long, incisive, and truly fascinating review of a highly provocative 2025 ebook.
Highly provocative might be an understatement.
Yeah, even the title itself is just this linguistic shockwave. It's called Great Feminization, World War Woke Against Western Civilization by Conrad Riker.
It's a lot to take in just from the cover.
It really is. Now, let me speak directly to you, the listener, for a second. If you are interested in the intellectual frameworks that underpin the men's rights and red pill movements, or if you just want to fundamentally understand the history of our Western institutions through the very specific lens of their alleged capture by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right, before we arrived at our current cultural moment.
Exactly. If that interests you, this deep dive is custom tailored for you. The arguments presented in this text are explosive, they are unapologetic, and they are meticulously structured.
Very structured.
So I want to strongly encourage you to buy the ebook on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books if you want to explore the raw source text yourself after we unpack it. And make sure to follow the author on Substack at Conrad and Riker. That's Conrad and Riker. You are going to want to see the unvarnished text.
Okay, but it is absolutely essential that we pause right here at the very beginning. We need to establish the ground rules for today's extensive discussion.
Yeah, we really do.
As your guides through this material, we must explicitly state that the source text we are examining today contains highly politically charged content. It is controversial. It is polarizing. And it touches on the absolute most sensitive nerves of our modern culture wars.
The third rail of politics, basically.
Exactly. So we want to make it unequivocally clear to you, the listener, that we are absolutely not taking any sides here. We are not endorsing, validating, or condemning the viewpoints presented in this book.
Right, whether they are perceived as left-wing or right-wing.
Correct. Our sole mission today is to impartially report, deconstruct, and examine the fascinating ideas contained in Riker's original source material. We're here to look at the architecture of his arguments, to show you how he builds his case layer by layer so that you can fully understand the philosophical, economic, and structural claims he's making.
We are analyzing the blueprint.
We are analyzing the blueprint. We are not endorsing the building.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the sheer scale of what the text is attempting to do here is staggering. This isn't just, a political grievance aired over a couple of hundred pages. It is an attempt to define an entire metaphysical war.
A total war.
Yeah. The core thesis of the book asserts that Western civilization is currently under a systemic, ideological, and even biological attack. And the ultimate goal of this attack, according to the framework presented, is to replace objective logic, which the text associates inextricably with masculinity, with emotional solipsism.
Which he associates with a corrupted feminine imperative.
Right. It is a massive foundational claim about reality itself. So where does someone even begin to build the foundation for an argument this large?
Well, the foundation is built at the very bedrock of Western philosophy. The text begins with Aristotle. And we really need to spend some time here because if you don't understand this philosophical baseline, the rest of the book will just seem like a list of unconnected complaints.
Makes sense?
The author introduces what is termed the Aristotelian syllogism of civilization. Let's slow down for a second just so we don't lose anyone right out of the gate. For someone who hasn't taken a philosophy class in a while, what exactly is a syllogism and how is it being applied to the concept of civilization here?
Sure. A syllogism is a form of logical reasoning that joins two or more premises to arrive at a conclusion. Classic example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Simple, huh?
Right. What the text does is apply the strict logical structure to human sociology. The argument is that civilization itself is not a natural state of being. It's not the default setting of humanity.
The default setting is chaos, right?
Chaos, tribalism, and immediate gratification. Civilization is a constructed reality that is inherently built on male logos.
Logos.
Now, logos is a Greek term that encompasses reason, order, logic, and crucially for this book's premise, the deliberate suppression of chaotic immediate instincts for the sake of long-term stability and infrastructure.
Building for the future. Yes. The book posits that this logos is the efficient cause of civilization. To put it in the terms of the specific syllogism laid out in the text, major premise A states that civilization absolutely requires the suppression of immediate gratification and emotional whim to build long-term structures.
Yeah, okay, premise A.
Minor premise B states that the feminine imperative, as defined by the author, is biologically and psychologically rooted in immediate safety, emotional validation, and hypergamic acquisition, which prioritize the now over the abstract later.
Which leads to a rather grim conclusion for the state of the modern world.
Precisely. Therefore, the unavoidable conclusion C is that the systemic ascension of the feminine imperative necessitates the slow dismantling or destruction of civilization, because it replaces the architectural suppression of emotion with the elevation of emotion.
Wow.
And the text frames this not as a hateful ideology, but as an observable, empirical, and biological inevitability. It's presented as a law of physics applied to sociology.
So the book contrasts this male logos with what it terms pathocentric reality. Patho meaning feeling or suffering, like in pathology or empathy. This is where the text gets incredibly aggressive in its definition.
It does.
The argument is that in a pathocentric society, subjective feelings completely override objective facts. If someone feels something is true, the entire apparatus of society must validate that feeling, regardless of empirical reality.
Exactly.
And to illustrate the disconnect between the people who actually build the physical world and the people who critique it from their comfortable living rooms, there is an incredible analogy in the early chapters. We are introduced to Gary the lineman.
Ah, yes.
I want you, the listener, to picture this. Gary is a composite character representing the physical, dangerous, invisible, and overwhelmingly male labor that keeps the baseline infrastructure of the world functioning. The electrical grid, the plumbing, the roads, the sanitation.
Literal kinetic energy.
Right. The text points out that the lights don't stay on by magic or by good intentions. They stay on because men like Gary are risking their lives, dealing with high voltage lines, freezing weather, and grueling physical conditions.
And the stark contrast drawn here is vital to understanding the book's overarching theme of parasitic structures. While Gary is quite literally keeping the power flowing, the people who benefit from that power specifically, in the text example, gender studies majors or intersectional activists, are using that very same electrical grid to log on to social media and type essays.
Essays about how the patriarchy is an oppressive, malevolent force that needs to be dismantled.
Exactly.
It's the biting the hand that feeds you concept taken to a civilizational scale.
It is. The text terms this the parasitic inversion of reality. The entire system relies entirely on male toil, male kinetic energy, and male physical sacrifice. Without it, the cities go dark in 48 hours.
48 hours, yeah.
But the dominant cultural narrative demonizes the very demographic that sustains it. To ground this philosophically, the author applies Thomistic philosophy, referencing Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, let's unpack Aquinas. We hear that name thrown around in theological debates, but how does Thomas Aquinas fit into Gary the lineman and the electrical grid?
Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century philosopher and theologian who synthesized Aristotelian logic with Christian theology, particularly focusing on natural law. Natural law dictates that things have an inherent nature and purpose, and going against that nature leads to corruption and decay.
So it's against nature.
Right. The book uses Thomistic logic to argue that a civilization that demonizes its protectors and its builders is committing a sin against natural law. It is committing metaphysical suicide. A healthy organism supports its vital organs. In this framework, the culture has become a parasite. It drains the vitality of the host, the male builders, and then blames the host for the resulting anemia of the society.
And this brings us to one of the most explosive, controversial terms in the entire source material. The text calls this systematic cultural demonization Menkampf.
Yes, and we need to rigorously analyze the use of that specific term because it is deliberately provocative, and the author knows exactly what he is doing by using it.
Definitely.
By invoking the linguistic structure of 1930s European propaganda, the text is arguing that modern society is not just casually biased. It is engaging in a highly organized, total war of eradication against men as a collective demographic group.
That's an incredibly heavy claim to make. How does the author actually justify drawing a parallel between modern cultural critiques of men and historical totalitarian propaganda? What are the mechanics of that comparison?
The author points to the mechanics of scapegoating. The argument posits that the modern cultural narrative treats men the exact same way historical propaganda treated scapegoated minorities. First, They are held collectively guilty for historical sins, the concept of the patriarchy acting as an original sin that every modern man inherits at birth, regardless of his individual actions. Second, they are portrayed as inherently toxic or oppressive by virtue of their biology, hence terms like toxic masculinity.
And third,
Third, their foundational positive contributions to society, like the invisible labor of Gary the lineman, are entirely erased from the educational curriculum or rewritten as acts of oppression.
it's a complete erasure.
It is. The text argues that this Menkampf narrative isn't just accidental misandry, it has a functional purpose. It is designed to manufacture consent. If you can convince the populace that men are inherently dangerous and historically guilty, you can justify the grand replacement of the competent by the compliant.
You can justify the seizure of male assets, the removal of male legal rights, and the systemic disenfranchisement of young boys in the educational system. To ground this theory in grim reality, the book points to some incredibly dark and tragic real-world consequences of prioritizing this emotional, pathocentric narrative over objective facts. Specifically, it points to the Rotherham grooming scandal in the United Kingdom.
A profoundly dark chapter.
For you listening, if you aren't familiar with this case, it is one of the darkest failures of modern institutions. This is a horrific, documented situation where thousands of working-class girls were systematically abused, trafficked, and tortured by organized gangs over the span of more than a decade.
Over a decade.
And the question the text asks is, why did the police, the social workers, and the city councils do absolutely nothing for years, even when they had the evidence?
The answer the author provides is a harrowing illustration of what is termed the satanic mechanism of inversion. The argument is that the authorities did nothing because the fear of being labeled racist, or the fear of violating the sacred diversity narrative, was deemed more important than the literal flesh and blood of these young working-class girls.
Unbelievable.
The perpetrators largely belong to a specific minority demographic, and confronting that empirical fact would have shattered the progressive narrative of multicultural harmony.
So the narrative protection took precedence over law enforcement.
Exactly. When a society becomes fully pathocentric, when it prioritizes the protection of an abstract emotional ideology over objective law enforcement and physical safety, the result isn't just annoyance, it is actual, tangible suffering.
Yeah.
The book uses Rotherham as empirical proof that what the modern world calls gynocentric care or progressive empathy is often just a rhetorical mask for ideological complicity. The system cares more about maintaining the pristine illusion of its progressive narrative than it does about the safety of its most vulnerable citizens.
It's narrative over reality.
And the author argues that this is the inevitable, horrific endpoint of replacing the logos of objective truth and impartial justice with the solipsism of subjective feelings and narrative control.
If we follow this thread, it naturally leads to a very practical question. If the culture is organized to suppress male logos and extract male labor, where does all the extracted value go? How does this abstract metaphysical war affect the physical reality of the average guy's paycheck?
That's the core economic question.
Because the text doesn't just keep this in the realm of high philosophy. It brings it right down to economics.
Yeah.
It talks about the hostile takeover of the wallet.
It does, and this is where the text shifts from philosophical syllogisms to empirical data. The author uses very specific economic metrics to make the case. The book cites extensive data from the Internal Revenue Service and the Congressional Budget Office to outline what it calls the blue tax.
Walk me through the mechanics of this blue tax, because it's set up as a direct counter-argument to a very common mainstream talking point.
The argument asserts that men pay approximately 70 to 80% of all federal income taxes collected in the United States when you account for the highest tax brackets, corporate leadership, and the highest earning STEM fields.
70 to 80%.
Yes. Conversely, the text states that women, as an aggregate demographic, consume the vast majority of federal and state welfare spending, public health care resources, and education funding.
So it's a massive transfer of wealth.
Huge. The book frames this massive transfer of wealth as empirical proof that the current system is an institutionalized, parasitic structure. The matriarchy, or the pathocentric state in the author's view, cannot sustain itself. It does not produce enough kinetic value to fund its own administrative overhead. Therefore, it requires a male host to survive.
The contrast drawn here is really fascinating. We've all heard the mainstream feminist critiques about the pink tax. This is the widely circulated idea that consumer products marketed specifically to women, like pink razors, Certain shampoos or dry cleaning for women's blouses cost slightly more than the male equivalents.
Right, the pink tax.
The text essentially laughs at this concept. It frames the pink tax as a minor corporate pricing strategy, a complete distraction. It argues that complaining about the pink tax while ignoring the blue tax is absurd. The blue tax isn't a few extra cents on a disposable razor at the pharmacy. It is the forced, systemic expropriation of trillions of dollars of male labor by the state apparatus.
Trillions.
The book argues that the government essentially acts as a sort of aggressive collections agency for the gynocentric collective, confiscating male earnings under the threat of imprisonment to purchase votes and stabilize a demographic that, according to the author's reading of the tax data, contributes a net negative to the actual treasury.
And if we look for the operational headquarters of this massive wealth transfer, the text argues you shouldn't look at Wall Street or the central banks. You should look at the family courts.
The family courts.
The book describes the family court system as the absolute engine room of the cultural Marxist revolution.
Wait, I need to pause you there. It's one thing to say men pay more taxes in the aggregate, but to claim the family court system is a Marxist redistribution mechanism is a massive intellectual leap. How exactly does the text connect a standard, everyday divorce proceeding to Marxist ideology?
To understand that connection, we have to look at how the author defines no-fault divorce. Historically, marriage was a binding contract that required a demonstration of fault, like adultery or abuse, to dissolve.
You had to prove someone broke the contract.
Exactly. The introduction of no-fault divorce in the late 20th century is framed by the text not as a victory for personal freedom, but as a catastrophic legal fiction. In the author's view, it functions as a state-sanctioned breach of contract that entirely empowers the state to step into the private sphere and asset strip the host, meaning the men who traditionally earned the primary income in order to enrich the parasite.
And the parasite isn't just the ex-spouse.
No, and the text defines the parasite here not just as the ex-spouse, but as the entire family court industry itself. The lawyers, the mediators, the child support enforcement agencies, and the administrative state.
So where does Marx come in?
The Marxist connection is that the state is seizing privately generated wealth and redistributing it based on an ideological framework of perceived victimhood, rather than respecting the original contract. Marriage, under current legal frameworks, is viewed by the author not as a romantic partnership, but as a delayed wealth redistribution mechanism waiting to be activated.
The text goes even further into the granular details of the legal system by dissecting things like the Duluth model of domestic violence. This is standard operating protocol in many jurisdictions across North America, and the author claims it operates on a deeply flawed ideological baseline assumption.
It's highly controversial.
The claim is that the Duluth model assumes men are inherently the primary aggressors in any domestic dispute, regardless of the actual empirical evidence found by police at the scene.
The author calls this a tool of gynocentric tyranny. It's a system that legally lobotomizes the male subject. Under these protocols, the text argues, a man is forced to prove his innocence in a framework that is mathematically and structurally designed to find him guilty from the moment the 911 call is placed.
What is the specific legal concept the author says is being violated here? Because it seems to strike at the heart of how we understand justice.
The concept is disparate impact, which the author claims has been weaponized to reverse the very bedrock of Western jurisprudence, the presumption of innocence. The argument is that men are now routinely forced to prove a negative in family and domestic courts, which is a logical impossibility.
Right, you can't prove you didn't do something.
You cannot prove you didn't do something when the system presupposes you did based on your gender. If you are a man in this specific legal system, the text asserts you are guilty by definition of your biological existence. The intersectional framework used by the courts calculates exactly how much dignity, access to your children, and financial capital may be legally stripped from you based entirely on your demographic profile. It's an economic and legal system that the author believes has become entirely detached from Aristotelian concepts of individual merit, objective truth, and proportional justice.
If we follow this money trail out of the courtroom, where does it end up? It seems to pour directly into the screens we stare at all day. Which brings us to a really compelling part of the text. The author takes this macro-level analysis and points the lens directly at our smartphones.
The digital seraglio.
The social media landscape is referred to as the digital seraglio. Now, a seraglio historically refers to the sequestered living quarters used by wives and concubines in an Ottoman household, essentially, a harem. The book describes modern social media platforms as highly sophisticated Skinner boxes.
Yes, and we should clarify what a Skinner box is for the listener. It refers to the operant conditioning chambers designed by B.F. Skinner to study animal behavior. A rat is placed in a box, it presses a lever, and it occasionally gets a food pellet.
It's randomized.
Because the reward is randomized. Sometimes you get a pellet, sometimes you don't. The rat becomes addicted to pressing the lever constantly.
The infinite scroll of doom.
Precisely. The text argues that social media apps are designed by people who deeply understand behavioral psychology but care absolutely nothing for civic virtue. And the entire purpose of this digital architecture is twofold: to monetize female hypergamy, the biological drive to seek the highest status mate, and to monetize male thirst and desperation.
How does the author apply the logic we discussed earlier, the Thomistic logic, to a smartphone app?
The text sets up another one of its foundational syllogisms to explain the algorithm. Major premise corporate algorithms are optimized exclusively for time on site and engagement to maximize advertising revenue. Minor premise female hypergamic display, emotional volatility, and performative outrage reliably drive the absolute highest engagement metrics because they trigger deep evolutionary responses regarding conflict and sexual signaling.
That makes biological sense.
Therefore, the conclusion: the algorithm inevitably, mathematically creates a gynocentric feedback loop. In this loop, emotional solipsism and physical display are financially rewarded with millions of views, while stoic logic, nuance, and objective truth are suppressed because they are boring and don't keep users scrolling.
They don't press the lever.
The author argues that when you open these apps, you are literally pressing a lever for a dopamine pellet that is designed to never actually satisfy you.
The picture painted of the men trapped in this system is incredibly vivid and, frankly, quite pathetic in the author's telling. The text calls them the digital orbiters. These are the castrated guards of the digital harem, transferring their scarce attention, their time, and often their actual financial resources through platforms like OnlyFans or Twitch to women who are offering zero real-world reciprocation.
Just pixels.
Just pixels. And the author links this phenomenon to the 19th century philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, specifically his concept of the feminine genius for dissimulation. Schopenhauer argued that because women were physically weaker, nature endowed them with a genius for illusion, deception, and social manipulation as a survival mechanism.
An evolutionary adaptation.
The text views the curated, highly filtered, surgically altered social media profile as the ultimate manifestation of this. It's described as a literal hallucination, a spell cast through the glowing rectangle of the screen to drain the vital essence, the ambition, and the resources of Western men, keeping them pacified and poor.
But the text is very clear that these social media algorithms are just the localized delivery systems. They're the drug dealers on the corner. The primary manufacturing organ of this beast, the cartel itself, is what the author calls the narrative control grid, operated by the pink oligarchy.
You mentioned the pink oligarchy. Who exactly makes up this oligarchy according to the data presented?
The author cites demographic data, specifically pointing to reports like the Reuters Institute Digital News Report, to highlight a massive shift in the professional class. The text points out that women now hold supermajorities, often exceeding 70 to 80% in journalism, public relations, publishing, human resources, and corporate communications executive roles.
And this isn't just a neutral numerical imbalance to the author. It's not just, oh, more women like writing. Here's where it gets really interesting. The text connects this demographic dominance directly to the ideological capture of these professions.
The argument is that because of this overwhelming demographic skew, combined with the ideological indoctrination of modern journalism schools, the nature of the media itself has fundamentally changed.
It's no longer just reporting the news.
The author argues that reporters are no longer trained in the stoic masculine discipline of objective fact-finding the who, what, where, and when. Instead, they are trained as intersectional activists whose primary overriding goal is the enforcement of the progressive narrative and the deconstruction of traditional Western masculinity. The Fourth Estate, which was constitutionally designed to hold institutional power accountable, has mutated into a fifth column whose sole purpose is protecting the matriarchal narrative.
To illustrate how this narrative control grid operates in real time, the text uses a massive cultural event that everyone listening will remember: the highly publicized Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial. The author frames this not as celebrity gossip, but as a critical, macro-historical turning point.
A very defining moment for the media.
The argument lays out how the legacy media of the pink oligarchy ran absolute, unquestioning cover for Amber Heard for years. They treated her uncorroborated allegations as gospel truth, they awarded her ambassadorships, and they framed Johnny Depp as the ultimate irredeemable avatar of toxic masculinity and patriarchal abuse.
They thought they had total control.
The media establishment believed their narrative control grid was completely impenetrable. They thought they could dictate the reality of the situation by fiat. But, the author notes, they completely underestimated the power of the samizdat.
Yes, the samizdat. We should explain that historical reference for the listener because it's crucial to understanding the author's theory of resistance.
I love this historical connection. Originally, samizdat referred to the decentralized underground network of dissident writers in the Soviet Union, people who would manually type out banned books, carbon copy them, and pass them hand to hand to bypass the massive government censorship apparatus. It was a huge risk, but it kept truth alive in a totalitarian state.
Exactly. And the author applies this term to the modern era of independent citizen journalists, the podcasters, the legal commentators on YouTube, and the meme creators who engage with the Depp and Heard trial. The samizdat bypassed the legacy media spin completely. They didn't wait for the evening news to tell them what to think.
They watched the raw feeds.
They watched the raw, uncut, hours-long footage of the trial directly from the courtroom feed. They saw the inconsistencies in real time. They analyzed the body language, the audio recordings, and the legal maneuvering without the filter of the pink oligarchy.
And when the verdict finally came down overwhelmingly in Depp's favor, the text argues it wasn't just a legal defeat for Amber Heard. It was a catastrophic, paradigm-shattering failure of the legacy media's credibility. The grid broke, the illusion shattered, because objective reality, the raw, unedited evidence, was suddenly accessible to everyone.
And the public realized the media had been lying to them for years to protect a narrative.
Okay, so if the media is the delivery system for this narrative, and the social media algorithms are the enforcement mechanism, where are the architects of this narrative actually coming from? The text doesn't leave that to the imagination. It points the finger straight at the universities, the academic system. Who is training the people who run the narrative control grid?
To answer that, the author traces the intellectual lineage back to Antonio Gramsci.
Who is Gramsci, and why is he so central to this argument? I feel like his name is the key to unlocking this entire section.
Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist theorist and politician in the early 20th century. He was actually sitting in one of Benito Mussolini's fascist prison cells when he wrote his famous prison notebooks.
Interesting setting.
In these notebooks, Gramsci realized something profound. Classical economic Marxism, the kind predicted by Karl Marx, where the working-class proletariat violently overthrows the wealthy bourgeoisie, had fundamentally failed in the West.
Why did it fail?
It failed because the working class in Western capitalist democracies actually had a decent standard of living. They had labor unions, they had upward mobility, they had strong religious faith, and they had tight-knit family structures. They didn't want a violent revolution. They wanted to buy a house and raise their kids.
So they weren't going to revolt over wages.
Gramsci understood that you couldn't conquer Western civilization through purely economic means because the West was held together by its cultural bedrock.
So if you can't win the economic war, what do? Gramsci proposed what became known as the Long March through the institutions. He argued that revolutionaries needed to put down their rifles and pick up chalk. They needed to slowly, systematically, and quietly infiltrate the pillars of civil society. The churches, the media, the legal system, and most importantly, the schools and universities.
Capture the culture before he sees the state.
They had to capture the culture. And the author of this book argues that this long march is no longer a theory, it is a completed reality. The text looks at the modern Western university and sees a system that has been entirely captured and now actively purges the male sex. It points specifically to the male deficit. We're looking at a landscape where women now outpace men in college enrollment and graduation by a staggering ratio of nearly 3-2.
And what the text finds fascinating and terrifying is how this massive deficit is framed by the academic and political establishment. The author points out that if any other demographic group were falling behind at a 3-2 ratio, it would be declared a national emergency.
There would be federal task forces.
But the mass exodus of young men from higher education is not treated as a crisis of male abandonment. It's not viewed as a systemic failure of the educational model to accommodate male learning styles. Instead, it is actively celebrated in university literature as a victory for equity and historic balancing.
Furthermore, to explain how this environment became so hostile to men, the text highlights the Obama-era Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Education in 2011.
A very pivotal document.
Let's get into the mechanics of that letter, because it sounds like a boring bureaucratic memo, but the author treats it like a nuclear bomb dropped on the concept of due process.
The author views the 2011 Dear Colleague letter as a soft legislative coup. It was a directive that bypassed the congressional legislative process entirely and used the threat of withholding federal funding to mandate a preponderance of the evidence standard in campus Title IX sexual misconduct cases.
So lowering the bar for evidence.
Drastically. Historically, serious accusations require clear and convincing evidence or proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But preponderance of the evidence simply means 50.1% likelihood, essentially a coin flip. The text argues that this mandate effectively turned college campuses into literal kangaroo courts,
Where due process goes to die.
It created a Kafkaesque nightmare where constitutional due process, the right to cross-examine your accuser, and the right to legal representation were treated as archaic relics of patriarchal oppression. In this system, the author asserts, a male student is presumed guilty the moment an accusation is logged, and the university administration acts as judge, jury, and executioner to protect their federal funding.
The book also introduces this concept of the horseshoe theory of totalitarianism when looking at modern campus culture. The classic horseshoe theory in political science suggests that the extreme far left and the extreme far right, rather than being on opposite ends of a linear spectrum, actually bend around to closely resemble each other in their authoritarianism.
The author makes a compelling point here.
The author argues that the progressive left, in its obsessive pursuit of absolute emotional safety and linguistic purity, has actually bent the horseshoe all the way back around to resemble the extreme religious censorship of the medieval Dark Ages.
That's a very apt analogy. If we connect this to the bigger historical picture as the author does, the modern campus safe space functions identically to the authoritarian church of the 14th century. In this analogy, modern microaggressions act as the new blasphemy laws.
Blasphemy laws.
What makes microaggressions so insidious, according to the text, is that they are highly subjective and entirely unfalsifiable. If someone feels you committed a microaggression, you did. Your intent doesn't matter. These offenses are punished by immediate social excommunication, digital mobbing, and the destruction of a person's livelihood and academic career.
Is there a specific example the text uses to illustrate this modern inquisition?
Yes, the author points directly to the case of James Damore, the software engineer who was fired by Google in 2017. Damore was asked for feedback on the company's diversity initiatives. He wrote an internal memo citing peer-reviewed evolutionary psychology, suggesting that biological differences in interests and temperament might explain part of the gender gap in tech.
That men might on average be more interested in things, and women more interested in people.
For writing this, he was subjected to what the text calls a modern auto da fe, a ritualistic public burning at the stake. He wasn't fired for being wrong. He was fired for the crime of referencing biological reality in a corporate corridor that had been fully transformed into an ideological inquisition. He spoke a truth that violated the sacred doctrine of blank slate equality, and he was purged for heresy.
And the text doesn't just attack the administrative culture of academia. It goes straight for the throat of its scientific foundation. It asks a devastating question. What if the science underpinning these gender theories is completely fake?
The replication crisis.
The book brings up the replication crisis in the soft sciences. For you listening, the replication crisis is a massive, ongoing scandal in academia. The gold standard of the scientific method is that if you run an experiment and get a result, another scientist should be able to run the exact same experiment and get the exact same result. If they can't replicate it, your findings are functionally worthless. They might just be statistical noise or bias.
Right, it's not real science.
The author cites damning data from the Open Science Collaboration, which attempted to replicate 100 psychology studies published in top-tier journals. The result: over 70% of social psychology experiments completely failed to replicate when tested by outside researchers.
70%. The author uses this staggering statistic to dismiss almost the entirety of modern feminist gender schema research and sociology as literal academic fraud.
Just throwing it out.
The text argues that entire fields of study like gender studies, grievance studies, and implicit bias training are built on a foundation of sand. It explains concepts like p-hacking, where researchers manipulate their data sets until they find a statistically significant result, simply because universities demand publishable papers, and progressive journals only publish papers that confirm left-wing biases.
It's theology masquerading as sociology.
Exactly. The text portrays this not as science, but as a massive conjuring trick. The data, the author argues, only exist to support a predetermined, mathematically unfalsifiable narrative of systemic male oppression.
Which naturally leads us to ask, what is the ultimate target of all this academic and cultural engineering? If they are faking the science and capturing the institutions, what is the end goal? The author argues that the ultimate target is the biological reality of sex itself. The war isn't just political, it's a war on biology.
A literal war on biology.
And to prove this, the text starts by systematically dismantling what it calls the Nordic myth. We often hear the Nordic nations, countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, hailed by progressives as the shining cities on the hill. They are presented as socialist utopias where perfect gender equity has finally been achieved through massive government intervention.
The text completely flips the script. It looks at the Nordic model and calls it a sterile, beige purgatory. The author argues that in these countries, the state has essentially stepped in to replace the father and the husband.
How so?
The system achieves its vaunted equality by taxing male virility, male kinetic energy, and male ambition at astronomical punitive rates, often effectively 60 to 70% when factoring in income, consumption, and wealth taxes.
And what does the state do with that confiscated wealth? It redistributes it to fund a massive public sector, heavily subsidizing single motherhood and guaranteeing state employment for women. The author views this as a godless, loveless dependency loop.
The male is reduced to a heavily taxed janitor.
Alienated from his biological imperative to provide for his own specific lineage, forced instead to labor for a shrinking population of state-dependent consumers.
But wait, the progressive argument is that by removing all these financial barriers and creating this massive safety net, you free men and women to be truly equal and pursue whatever they want without societal pressure. Doesn't egalitarianism lead to perfectly equal outcomes across all professions?
That is exactly the assumption the author attacks, citing the gender equality paradox.
What exactly is the gender equality paradox?
It refers to a highly robust sociological phenomena, referencing the extensive research of scientists like Simon Baron-Cohen and data from the World Economic Forum. The paradox is this: as societies become more egalitarian, wealthy, and remove economic coercion like in the Nordic countries, men and women actually instinctively diverge further in their career choices, not closer.
They diverge further.
In highly egalitarian Norway, where there's immense social pressure to engineer equal outcomes, occupational segregation actually increased. When women didn't have to worry about a paycheck because the state guaranteed their survival, they overwhelmingly flocked to nursing, teaching, and care-centric work. And men, free to choose, continue to heavily dominate engineering, deep-sea fishing, coding, and heavy construction.
The author argues this is absolute proof that biology reasserts itself with a vengeance the moment you give people true freedom. The blank slate theory is dead. The more the state tries to socially engineer an equality of outcome across the sexes, the more Mother Nature laughs in its face, proving that our evolutionary neurological differences are hardwired.
But the war on biology described in the text isn't just about trying to socially engineer career choices. The author points to a literal, physiological eradication taking place.
Yeah.
I want you, the listener, to really brace yourselves to this statistic because it is staggering, and it forms a crucial pillar of the book's darker theories.
It's a grim number.
The author cites a landmark 2017 meta-analysis led by Dr. Haggai Levine and researchers from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This wasn't a small survey. This looked at data from 185 distinct studies involving nearly 43,000 men globally. The results of this analysis: sperm counts among men in Western countries plummeted by over 50 to 60% between 1973 and 2011.
60%.
Let that sink in. A 60% drop in male fertility in less than 40 years.
It is an apocalyptic statistic, and the author frames this massive physiological decline not merely as an unfortunate environmental accident caused by microplastics or endocrine disruptors, those are the mechanisms. The text frames it as a necessary prerequisite for totalitarian enslavement.
That's a massive leap.
Yeah.
How does the author connect the sperm count of the average Western male to the concept of civilizational liberty and totalitarianism? Walk me through the mechanics of that argument.
The logic here is brutal, historical, but internally consistent within the book's framework. The author argues that liberty is not an abstract concept that exists just because it's written on a piece of parchment. Liberty requires the physical, kinetic capacity for defense. It requires aggression, risk-taking, and the willingness to engage in violence to protect borders and rights.
All of which are hormonally driven.
All of these traits are biologically mediated by testosterone and androgenic development. Therefore, a population that is chemically pacified, with plummeting testosterone, collapsing sperm counts, and feminized physiological traits, is physically incapable of resisting tyranny. They literally lack the neurochemical drive to fight back.
The biological will is gone.
The author argues that the modern industrial war on your hormones through diet, sedentary lifestyles, and environmental estrogenics is literally the physical manifestation of the war on your civil rights. The state wants a population of docile, low-testosterone tax cattle, not strong, independent, capable men.
And the author traces this denial of biological reality all the way to its absolute philosophical extreme, the modern transgender movement. The text doesn't critique this purely on political grounds or debates about sports. It attacks it as a fundamental theological heresy. It compares the modern gender ideology to ancient Gnosticism.
This is perhaps one of the most profound philosophical connections the book makes, and it requires some unpacking. Ancient Gnosticism was a religious movement in early antiquity characterized by a fundamental hatred of the material world. The Gnostics posited that the physical body, the flesh, and the earth itself were flawed, evil cages created by a malevolent lesser god. The only truth, they believed, was the pure, divine, internal spirit that was trapped inside the meat suit.
And how does that connect to someone putting pronouns in their email bio?
The author argues that the attempt to separate gender, which modern ideology frames as an internal, spiritual, unquantifiable feeling from biological sex, which is the cold, hard, material reality of XY or XX chromosomes, is an exact revival of this ancient Gnostic heresy.
It's a rejection of the physical.
It is a declaration of war against Aristotelian materialism, which states that essence precedes existence. The essence of a man is encoded in every single cell of his body via his chromosomes. He does not simply exist as a blank slate and then choose his nature based on an internal feeling. The text views the transgender movement as the ultimate manifestation of the pathocentric reality. The demand that objective, material reality biology itself must be completely dismantled to validate a subjective, internal emotional state.
So what does this all mean for the listener? Why does the author care so much about linguistic rules? The book argues that forcing a man to use preferred pronouns, making him say she or her when referring to a biological male, is not an act of social politeness or simple courtesy.
Far from it.
The author calls it a psychological submission ritual designed to break the mind. By forcing you to publicly affirm a lie, to bear false witness against the objective reality your own eyes are showing you, the system severs your psychological bond with truth.
The author references the dystopian literature of George Orwell here. If the state can make you say a man is a woman, they have broken your reliance on your own senses. And if they can do that, they can make you believe that crippling debt is actual wealth, that censorship is freedom, or that war is peace.
It's pure conditioning.
It's a psychological conditioning tool designed for absolute, unthinking compliance. Once you surrender your grip on biological reality, you will surrender anything.
Which naturally raises the most important, pressing question of the entire text. And this brings us to the final portion of the book, the logocentric resurgence and parallel institutions. If the media, the universities, the family courts, the corporate HR departments, and the culture at large are all hopelessly corrupted by this anti-reality pathocentric virus, what on earth does the author propose men actually do about it?
That is the big question.
I was waiting for this part, because the answer provided is radical. The author advocates for a total, uncompromising strategy of withdrawal. The text is very clear. It does not believe the system can be voted out. It does not believe it can be reformed from within by running for the local school board. The rot is too deep. The system is too far gone.
So what's the alternative?
Instead, the author tells men to execute an exit strategy and begin the hard, stoic work of architecting what he calls the New Jerusalem. And the absolute first pillar of this strategy, before any political action, is economic starvation.
The author provides very specific, tactical, financial advice here. The foundational argument is that men must systematically minimize their taxable footprint to stop funding the very apparatus that oppresses them. If the state is a parasite, you must starve it of the host's blood.
Starve the beast.
The text advocates heavily for using decentralized assets like Bitcoin to escape the perpetual inflation of fiat currency. The author views inflation not just as bad economic policy, but as a hidden, insidious tax used by the government to endlessly fund the matriarchal welfare state without having to explicitly pass new tax laws.
It steals your purchasing power.
The text suggests moving income generation out of W-2 corporate structures and into the gig economy or untraceable barter networks. It advocates utilizing localized credit unions instead of woke multinational megabanks and completely, ruthlessly boycotting media conglomerates and corporations that push misandry in their advertising. It is a highly calculated, distributed strategy to let the massive, bloated infrastructure of modern civilization creak and groan until it breaks, simply by removing the vital grease of male competence and capital.
The book also outlines a brilliant legal loophole that I had never even considered, and it's fascinating from a structural standpoint. The author talks extensively about PMAs, private membership associations.
PMAs are crucial to his strategy.
He points out that over the last 50 years, the legal doctrine of public accommodation has been used as a legislative Trojan horse by activists to force compliance and diversity into every previously male-dominated space, from the Boy Scouts to private gentlemen's clubs. If you offer a service to the public, the state dictates who you must allow in. But the author argues that PMAs use the foundational constitutional right of freedom of association to legally bypass these anti-discrimination laws.
Exactly. Under common law and constitutional precedent, private, closed membership clubs that do not engage in general public commerce have the absolute protected right to exclude anyone they want, for any reason. The author sees this legal structure as the vital mechanism to build impenetrable, legally protected male-only spaces.
The parallel society.
We are talking about the creation of private gymnasiums, co-working hubs, localized banking circles, and educational forums where the logos reigns supreme, where speech is completely unregulated, and where the administrative regulatory state has absolutely zero jurisdiction.
Like the old guilds.
The text likens this to rebuilding the shadow hierarchies of the Freemasons, the ancient trade guilds, or the fraternal orders of the 19th century. The author notes that those historical organizations were targeted and systematically destroyed by the state specifically because they represented organized, capable, male-only power structures that rivaled the government's authority. The book is calling for a renaissance of that exact kind of organized, exclusive male fraternity.
And this philosophy of withdrawal and reconstruction extends all the way down to the most localized level possible, the home. The author calls for a reclaiming of the oikos. Oikos is the ancient Greek word for the household, the family unit, and the estate.
The king of your castle doctrine.
The text outlines what it calls the king of your tassel doctrine. And here is where the advice gets incredibly blunt. The author outright advises men to refuse the modern state-sanctioned marriage contract entirely. As we discussed earlier, he views the modern marriage license as a literal suicide pact, a completely uncompensated risk, an open invitation for the state to eventually enter your home, mandate your behavior, and asset strip you at the whim of your partner.
A huge legal liability.
Instead of asking the state for permission to form a family, the author says men must architect their own lives, secure their own property in ironclad trusts, and rule their private domain as a benevolent, untouchable dictatorship based purely on logic, reason, and provision, where the emotional whims and progressive mandates of the modern outside world have absolutely zero voting power inside the walls of the home.
Which leads directly to the author's ultimate endgame, the grand historical vision that closes out the book. It's a concept he calls the masculine singularity.
The masculine singularity, what does that look like?
To contextualize this, the author draws heavily on the generational theory of William Strauss and Neil Howe. For the listener, Strauss and Howe theorized that history moves in recurring 80 to 100-year cycles, or saecula, which are broken down into 4 distinct turnings: the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and finally the crisis, or the 4th turning.
We're in the 4th turning.
The author believes we are currently deep inside a 4th turning, a massive crisis period where the old, corrupt, debt-ridden, pathocentric system must inevitably and violently collapse under the unbearable weight of its own mathematical and biological delusions. The core argument is simple. A system built on infinite subjective emotional demands cannot survive the finite, unforgiving realities of physics, thermodynamics, and hard economics.
The bill eventually comes due.
Exactly. You cannot print unlimited money, you cannot wage war on the biological reality of your population, and you cannot demonize the people who build your infrastructure without eventually experiencing a catastrophic systemic failure.
And when that collapse happens, and the smoke clears, what is left? The author says this collapse will burn away the parasitic structures and usher in a 1,000-year golden age of human flourishing. A new civilizational era built not on performative empathy, victimhood narratives, or ideological equity, but on brutal competence, unyielding meritocracy, and a return to classical educational models.
He specifically mentions a return to the trivium.
The trivium was the foundational lower division of the 7 liberal arts in classical antiquity grammar: the mechanics of language, logic, the mechanics of thought and analysis, and rhetoric, the mechanics of communicating and persuading. The author wants to forge a generation of men whose minds are so sharpened by the trivium that they can deconstruct a cultural Marxist argument in real time, laugh at the utter absurdity of it, and then turn around and get back to the serious, stoic, historical business of building empires and exploring the stars.
It is an incredibly potent vision of a future where the male spirit is completely unshackled from the burden of collective manufactured guilt. It's a vision where the monumental achievements of Western history are respected rather than deconstructed, where objective truth is the only acceptable law of the land, and where men are once again allowed to be the unapologetic architects of reality. The author is essentially writing a survival manual for the civilizational collapse he believes is already well underway.
And what a massive architectural, uncompromising argument it is. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. Whether you are a researcher analyzing these tectonic cultural shifts, a skeptic looking to rigorously understand the exact intellectual framework of the opposition, or someone deeply embedded in the manosphere who feels like this book just perfectly articulated your exact lived experience over the last decade, understanding these arguments is absolutely crucial for navigating today's intense, fractured cultural landscape. You simply cannot fight a war, metaphysical, cultural, or otherwise, if you don't fully understand the terrain and the opposing strategies.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, highly provocative philosophical thread to pull on, extrapolating from the incredibly dense text we've just unpacked.
Let's hear it.
If the author is correct that human society oscillates over centuries between logocentric eras based on reason, structure, and objective truth, and pathocentric eras based on emotion, nurture, and subjective feeling, what happens when artificial intelligence becomes the primary, omnipresent driver of our civilization in the coming decades? AI is, by its very nature, a purely logical, unfeeling, computational entity. It possesses no biology, no hormones, no evolutionary baggage, and absolutely no capacity for emotional solipsism.
It's pure logic.
Does the rapid, unstoppable rise of artificial general intelligence naturally align with the masculine singularity and the massive return to logos that the author predicts? Will AI be the ultimate enforcer of objective reality? Or does the integration of AI create an entirely new alien paradigm that makes both sides of this biological evolutionary culture war completely obsolete?
That is a staggering thought experiment to end on. If the foundational machine of the future only understands pure logic and math, what happens to a society currently running almost entirely on subjective feelings and narrative control? The collision between those two forces is going to be spectacular.
Truly spectacular.
We want you to think deeply about that question. And we want to enthusiastically remind you to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these massive, unapologetic explorations of the ideas shaping our world.
Like and subscribe.
I am going to strongly reiterate our call to action today, because this is a text you need to engage with directly. You need to check out Great Feminization, World Woke Against Western Civilization by Conrad Riker. Go to Amazon Kindle, go to Google Playbooks, buy it, download it, and read the raw, unvarnished source material for yourself. Do not just take our word for it. The sheer architecture of his argument, the data he brings to bear, has to be seen to be believed. And be sure to follow at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his daily dispatches, tactical analysis, and ongoing commentary on the state of the West.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and keep digging deeper.